Okay, so in today's video, we're going to take a look at this guy here. This is the new Hawkeye Thumb 2. And for those of you who don't know what this is basically a small form factor action camera that's kind of designed to go onto drones and fixed-wing aircraft. There's been a few iterations of these thumb-style cameras over the years. It started about 4 or 5 years ago with this one here. This is the Runcam Thumb camera. And over the years, various different versions have come out. Runcam brought out version 2. And then Hawkeye bought out version 1, and then they've now bought out version 2 as well. And the point of these cameras is kind of to be, I guess, a poor man's version of a GoPro. Basically, these cameras, they're a lot cheaper than GoPros. They're also a lot smaller, and they weigh a lot less than GoPros. And they're designed to be kind of a convenient way for you to get HD footage, like nice HD flight footage from your aircraft, without having to spend a lot of money on an expensive GoPro. Now, in the past, I have reviewed several of these cameras here. I reviewed the Runcam Thumb 1 and then the Runcam Thumb 2. I also reviewed the Insta360 Go-To camera, which is a much more expensive, much more premium sort of style of camera like this. But in today's video, we're looking at this one here, which I feel kind of fits in somewhere between the Runcam Thumb 2 and the Insta360 Go-To. Now, just to give you a very quick overview, so this is a 4K capable camera that has a built-in gyro, so you can use it with gyro throw. It also has built-in Wi-Fi, which we'll talk about a little bit in a minute. And the most important thing is it actually now has a built-in battery. The other cameras in the past, like this one here, the Runcam Thumb 1, very much required you to wire them into your aircraft. You have to provide a power supply into the back so they can operate. This new one here by Hawkeye actually has a built-in battery, which means that you can use it on multiple aircraft without having to wire it in. So in this video, I'm going to give you a kind of a tour of this camera, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my experience with it, show you some footage, and then at the end, hopefully you will be informed as to whether you think this might be something you might be interested in. Okay, so to start the review, I've printed off a whole list of things here that I want to talk about. The first thing on the list is the unboxing experience. And there's not really a whole lot to say with regards to this. The camera comes in quite a basic box. It's quite a small one. It is branded with Hawkeye FPV on the outside, and then there's a sticker that just says it contains a Thumb 2. Inside the box, when you open it, first thing you see is the camera. And interestingly, the camera comes pre-installed in this mount. Now, this mount is a clip mount. It's designed to be used so you can attach the camera to maybe your hat or an item of clothing or just about anything you want to. It's quite a versatile mount that gives you a lot of options for mounting the camera in a lot of different places. Underneath the camera and the mount, you then get a instruction leaflet, and this is very basic. It shows you the very basic operation of the camera. But crucially, it contains the QR codes that you need to be able to scan so you can download the app to use the camera with your phone. Also to download the specific gyro flow software that you need. And there's also QR codes so you can download a much more comprehensive manual. Underneath the manual, you then get this cardboard piece here, which when you lift out of the way, it then reveals the final item in the box. And this is basically a necklace mount. So this is a mount that you can wear around your neck and you connect the camera to it. Allows you to then walk around whilst recording with the camera, keeping your hands free, and it doesn't require you to wear a hat. That's all you get in the box, and I was a little bit surprised by that. I would have expected there would have been some wiring included with this camera, because one of the features of this camera is that it can be wired into a drone. There is a plug on board the camera that allows you to do that. And when you've got it wired to a drone, it means you can provide a power supply to the camera to keep it operating for long periods of time. Also allows you to get a live video out, and also a remote trigger option. I was surprised to find that the wiring for that didn't come included, but the camera does at least have the socket there for you to do that if you wanted to. Okay, now we've done the unboxing, let's now do a quick tour of the camera. On the front of the camera, obviously you've got the lens, and then beside that you've got a little hole which is where a indicator LED is. This will change colour to let you know what the camera's doing, let you know which mode you're in, and it'll also flash to let you know if the camera's recording. On the sides of the camera, there is literally nothing. And then on the top of the camera, you've then got a button. This is a multi-purpose button that's used to turn the camera on and off. It's also used to turn the Wi-Fi on and off. And then last but not least, it's used to start and stop the recording. Beside that, you've then got this little plug here, which I mentioned a minute ago. This allows you to connect the camera up to the flight controller on your drone if you want to. So you can do things like remotely trigger the camera to start recording, and it also allows you to get a live video out if you want that. Beside that, there's then a USB-C port, and this is used to charge the camera if you want to. And it's also used to connect the camera to a computer, so if you want to offload the footage that way you can. And it also allows you to connect the camera to the computer to use it as a webcam. Beside that, there's then a little hole there, and I'm pretty sure that's just a microphone. On the back of the camera, there isn't anything other than a little hole here which says reset beside it. So if the camera ever crashes or something, you can poke a small cocktail stick in there or something to reset the camera. And then there's nothing else on the camera worth talking about other than on the underside. This is where the SD card slot is. And this now gives me an opportunity to talk to you a little bit about the specs. And the first thing we'll talk about is an SD card slot. So this camera can take up to a 256 gigabyte SD card, but it does need to be a category U3. So let's now get on my bit of paper. So the other specs that we need to talk about. So the dimensions of the camera are 53 by 23 by 22 millimeters. You can kind of see it by my hand here. It's a very small camera. Literally hasn't got very much size to it at all. And the weight of the camera is only 34 grams, which is amazing. Like I said earlier on, this is kind of like a alternative to a GoPro. GoPros, I think, weigh, I don't know, 100, 120 grams or something, probably even more than that. This is one of the reasons why cameras like this are very attractive, because they weigh very little. Obviously on fixed wing especially, weight is very important. So having a nice lightweight camera is a real benefit. As already mentioned, the camera can be charged by USB Type-C. And if you would rather charge the camera via the little plug on the side there, wire it up directly to your aircraft, you can then power it from anything from 5 to 23 volts, which is a nice big voltage range you can play with. As far as I can tell, the battery inside this camera is a 550 milliamp hour battery, and Hawkeye claims that it's good to allow this camera to record for up to 100 minutes. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a little bit. I've already mentioned that the camera can be used as an FPV camera if you want to, although I don't really know why you would, but if you want to, you can. And yes, I've already mentioned that it can be remotely turned on and off via the trigger. The other things is the fact that it's got gyro flow. I think I mentioned that a minute ago. So any footage that you record with this, you can then import into gyro flow and you can then stabilize it. And then finally, the last thing to mention is that it has built-in Wi-Fi. And the Wi-Fi is used so you can configure the camera, which we'll talk more about in a moment. So now we've been through all of that, let's talk a little bit about how you actually operate the camera. So like I said, on the top of the camera, there is this button here. If you press and hold it for about 2 or 3 seconds, you'll then hear the camera beep. That will then turn the camera on. If you want to then start recording, you literally just give it one quick press and it will start recording. Give it another quick press and it will stop recording. And then to turn the camera off, you just press and hold that button again until you hear a beep and then it will turn off. If you want to enable the Wi-Fi, which you need to do so you can configure the camera, you firstly turn the camera on by pressing and holding the button. And then once the camera's on, you then quickly press that button 2 times. That will enable the Wi-Fi, and then you'll see the little LED indicator on the front of the camera will then start flashing like it's red and green. That then puts the camera into Wi-Fi mode. Once you've got Wi-Fi mode enabled, you can then connect the camera to your phone. Now, as I mentioned a minute ago, the instruction leaflet that comes in the box has a QR code so you can download the app. I downloaded the version for Android because that's what I use, but I do believe there's also a iOS version for Apple users out there. And the app it's a weirdly named app. It's just called OK, which is a very odd name for an app. Doesn't really suggest what the app is used for. But actually, the app is actually very nice. It's a very simplistic app, but it seems to work very well. So to use the app, all you have to do is connect your phone to the Wi-Fi on the camera, and then you can open the app. You click this button here that says camera, and then you instantly get a live view coming through from the camera. And from this interface, you can then change a couple of settings. So up in the top right-hand corner here, there's this little cog icon. If you click that, you then get a list of different settings that you can change on this camera. Now, I won't go through all of these settings. You can kind of read them off the screen for yourself if you want to. The only ones I will mention that I found particularly useful is there's an option to rotate the camera. So if you've got the camera mounted upside down, click a button to kind of correct for that. And the other option I found very useful is the ability to turn the recording LED off on the camera. So if you want to record something covertly without kind of letting everyone know you've got a recording camera on your chest, you can do that. Back on the main screen, if you then click down here in the lower left, that then gives you the option to change the camera resolutions. And there are a lot of different settings that you can use on this camera in terms of resolution. So you start all the way at the bottom at 1080p at 25 frames per second. You can then go up to 1080p 50 frames per second. You've then got options for 2.5K in various different frame rates. And then crucially, you've got 4K at 30 frames per second. There is also a 4K at 50 frames per second option on here, but for some reason, when you use that specific mode, you can't record the gyro data. With all of the other modes, all the other resolution settings, you have the option to include the gyro data if you want to, but with 4K, 50 frames per second, unfortunately, you can't have the gyro data with it. Now, whilst we're on the note of the resolution options for this camera, I do just want to point out that this camera is only able to record in the new H.265 codec. There's no option for the older H.264 codec on here, which is a little bit annoying. The only reason why I want to mention that is because if your computer is maybe a little bit older, a couple of years older, you may find that the footage you record on this camera, when you import it to your computer, you might not natively be able to actually view it, or you may not be able to edit it because your video editor might not support it. Unfortunately, there are some workarounds for that, which we'll talk about a little bit in a moment. But I just thought it was important to mention that this records in the H.265 codec. Okay, so now I've given you a little bit of a tour of the camera, I've explained the specs to you, and I've kind of showed you what's in the box. Let's now talk a little bit about what it's actually like to use and what is the footage like. Now, the weird thing about this camera is that Hawkeye are kind of advertising it as being more of a generic action camera. With the original Hawkeye Thumb 1, they very much kind of marketed it as being an action camera to put on a drone or a fixed-wing aircraft. Whereas with this one, they're trying to kind of be competition for Insta360, I think. The marketing this camera is kind of being competition for the Insta360 Go 2 or the Go 3 cameras. On the website, they sort of have example images of how the camera can be used. And they have it on the chest mount, on the head mount. They've even got an image of it attached to a pet. They're trying to show that you can use this camera for a whole lot of different reasons other than just drones. So with that in mind, when I did some testing with this camera, the first couple of tests I did was to test it as just a generic action camera. So the first test I did was I literally installed the camera into the clip mount, and then I put the clip mount on my hat, and then I put the hat on my head, and then I just went out for a walk. And I was actually quite impressed with the footage that I got from that first test. The image was nice and clear, it was decently exposed, the wide range seemed to be okay. And it was a nice wide image as well. The lens is a 170 degree wide angle lens on there, so you had a nice big wide view as I was going out for a walk. The only thing that I wasn't super impressed with on that first initial test was the audio. This is just a quick audio test. I did find it to be just a little bit muffled and a little bit tinny. But overall, I was, reasonably happy with the quality of the footage that I was getting out of this camera, especially given its small size. Now, obviously, this camera is a gyro camera, so one of the first things I did after I recorded footage was throw it into GyroFlow to see, what the footage looked like when it was stabilized. And unfortunately, that's where things started to fall apart. So I'll put the footage up here on screen so you see. After I stabilized the footage with GyroFlow, it basically looked horrible. The footage just looks very shaky, very unpleasant. Actually, it starts to make you feel a little bit sick as you're watching it. And it's important that I mentioned that I was using the custom version of GyroFlow that Hawkeye FPV had provided. As I mentioned a little bit earlier in the video, in the box there's a little bit of paper with some QR codes on, and one of those QR codes takes you to a download for a custom version of GyroFlow, which Hawkeye have specifically tweaked and tuned so that it can be used with this camera. So I was using all of the presets that they kind of cultivated for this camera, and I expected to therefore get a very good output from GyroFlow, but as you can see here, it really didn't work very well. I did try tweaking the settings myself to see if I could get a better output, but no matter what I did, the footage just ended up looking really bad as soon as I tried stabilizing it. Now, after I did the walking test, I then went out and I did a running test. And the reason why I did that is because on Instagram, Hawkeye actually uploaded a clip to their reels on there showing the camera looking very smooth and very stable whilst being worn by someone whilst they were running. So obviously I wanted to see whether that looked any good. So, same setup as before. I had the camera on my hat and I went out for a run. And you can see the footage here. This is the raw footage of me just going for a run, and it kind of looks like you'd expect. You can see the camera going up and down quite a lot as I'm taking each step. Again, then try stabilizing the footage in Gyro using the custom version Hawkeye provided, and I ended up with this. As you can see, it looks terrible and it's quite nauseating to watch. So after doing those two tests, I was starting to get a little bit worried about, is the gyro on board this camera actually working very well or not? Like, what's going on? Like, it's supposed to be a gyro camera, and yet the two times I've tried using it, it didn't work very well at all. Now, for an interesting comparison, I took the video from this run, and rather than put it into Gyro, I instead put it into DaVinci Resolve. Now, for those of you who don't know what DaVinci Resolve is, it's a free video editing piece of software that anyone can download. It's a very advanced video editor. It's very good, and I think it's used by a lot of professionals out there. But the reason why I used it is because part of DaVinci Resolve is it has a very good optical stabilizer built into it. So just as an experiment, I thought I'd be interested to put the running footage into DaVinci, run the optical stabilizer, and see what I could get. And the result I got was this footage here. And although it's not fantastic footage, you still see the camera moving up and down, and it kind of warps the image a little bit. It looks infinitely better than the footage that I got from Gyro. Now, I just wanted to point this out because I'm going to mention this a few more times throughout this video. The DaVinci Resolve actually is a very good bit of software, and the optical image stabilizer on there is actually a much better alternative to using Gyro, in my opinion. Now, after doing those two tests, I then decided to try out the necklace mount for the camera. And I'm not really sure what this mount is designed for. I guess it's just so that you can carry the camera on you whilst keeping your hands free and also not wear a hat if for any reason you want to. Like I said, I don't really understand what the necklace mount's for, but I thought I'd give it a go. Straight away, I didn't love it because I found that just because of the shape of, the human anatomy and, where the pendant ends up on your chest, it meant that the camera ended up facing kind of a weird angle sort of upwards. It's very hard to get the camera to kind of face sort of directly forwards. That's kind of like hold my body in a bit of a weird pose to get it to do that. But I did do it. I did wear the camera on my chest for a little bit. And again, I went for a little bit of a walk. I ended up going to a pub with my partner. And I recorded some footage whilst I was there. And again, the footage looks absolutely fine straight out of the camera. But as soon as you try and stabilize it, it just ends up looking like this. It just ends up looking like complete and utter rubbish. So yeah, after doing those three tests, I really don't understand the gyro aspect of this camera. It just does not work with Gyro at all. And maybe I'm doing something wrong, but like I said, I'm using the preset version of Gyro that Hawkeye is recommending. So yeah. But yeah, after doing those three tests, they did a fourth test, and in this case, I went for a ride on my motorbike. I connected the camera up to my helmet, and then I went for a ride across town, just so I could see, is the camera any good at sort of being a dash cam kind of sort of situation, or could you use it for semi-extreme sports, for example? And it was actually quite an interesting test because I did this on a day which was very bright sunlight, but it was later in the day, so you were getting a lot of shadows being cast across the road. That was a really good test for the wide dynamic range to see how well it was working. In general, the footage from riding the motorbike looked very nice. Again, that nice wide angle lens meant you had a good view of the road as you were riding. But in terms of the wide dynamic range, so I'll pause the video at this point here. So you'll see that at the moment the camera is it's exposed to part of the road which is in the shadow, but then the part that's in the highlight is looking very, very blown out. But if I then progress the video forward a few frames, you then see that the camera does then catch up and it does start to expose the part of the video that's in the highlight. Basically, what I found was that the wide dynamic range on the camera is reasonably good, but it is a little bit slow. The camera is able to sort of transition from a dark area to a light area and expose them correctly, but it just takes a few seconds to get there. It's not as quick at making that adjustment as maybe something more advanced like a GoPro or a DJI Osmo Action. But yeah, as I said, the footage from the camera was reasonably decent, but I wanted to see what it looked like whilst it was stabilized. So I put it into Gyro, and this is the result that I got. I think you'll agree that doesn't look particularly good. It's ended up cropping the video a lot. You can't see anything in the horizon. It's very much just kind of cropped it in, so you're looking kind of downwards. You can't see very much, and also the footage just doesn't look very stabilized. Now, for comparison, here's that same bit of footage stabilized in DaVinci Resolve using the optical stabilizer. And I think you'll agree that actually does look pretty good. As I mentioned a minute ago, DaVinci Resolve is a fantastic bit of software that I think it's overlooked by a lot of people. And all these cameras coming out of built-in gyros, I've yet to find one which works particularly good with gyroflow. More often than not, I end up using DaVinci. I think you can see why. Now, the final test I did after the motorbike test, before I then proceeded to do flight footage, was I just did an endurance test with the camera. Hawkeye is suggesting this camera can record for up to 100 minutes, which is quite a bold claim for a camera, which is this small, so I wanted to see whether that was truthful. So I fully charged the camera from flat, completely flat, and it took 88 minutes for it to charge, and that was on a rapid speed charger. And I then set it up looking out of a window, and I had the camera set to 1080p at 25 frames per second. And I literally just left it recording until the battery went flat. And what I managed to get actually was 95 minutes of recording, which I actually thought was very respectable. It's not quite the 100 minutes that Hawkeye was advertising, but I think 95 minutes for a camera this small, recording HD footage, I think that's very, very impressive. That's a definite win for me. I should also mention as well, actually, that during that test, the camera didn't get hot. It got very slightly warm, but it didn't get hot. And it wasn't in a ventilated area. It was very much indoors. The camera stayed nice and cool. So anyway, let's now talk about flight footage, because that is what my channel is about. I am a drone pilot. Most of my videos are about flying. So most of you are probably wanting to see what is this camera like when you put it onto an aircraft. So I installed the camera on my Atom RC Dolphin. I just made a very basic little 3D printed mount so I could install it on the nose here. And then I went out one evening to do a series of flights. Now, I just want to mention that all of these flights were done at sunset, which is an interesting time of day, I think, to be doing flying, because it was a very sunny day. The sun was very low in the sky. Kind of provides a very tricky kind of lighting situation for a camera. But actually, I think that's kind of a good thing, because it's a good way to test how good is the camera's wide dynamic range, how well can it respond to the light levels as they're changing rapidly, and the fact it's getting a little bit dark. I also just want to mention as well that it was actually a very calm day that I was doing these flights. There wasn't a whole lot of wind or turbulence. So actually the footage looked quite smooth and stable anyway, before I even got around using gyroflow, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So the first flight that I did was with the camera just set to 1080p at 50 frames per second. And yeah, here's the footage. And I think you'll agree it looks quite nice. There isn't really a whole lot to say about it, I don't think. As I've already mentioned, like the wide dynamic range is reasonably good for this camera. It's a nice wide field of view. The image looks nice and sharp. There's plenty of like detail. Colors look good. Yeah, it's just nice footage. The only thing that I do want to mention is about the audio quality. I did mention a few minutes ago about the audio quality in the camera being a little bit muffled and a little bit tinny. But just in case any of you are wondering what it sounds like when it's on board an aircraft whilst it's flying, I'll play you a few seconds of that now. As you can hear, it doesn't sound particularly good, does it? It sounds pretty awful. It's a shame that this camera doesn't have any kind of like wind noise suppression kind of built into it. That's something that the RunCam Thumb 2 camera did have, and it works very well. It's a shame that you don't have a similar option on this camera here. So anyway, this is the footage, straight out of the camera. And like I said, it was kind of recorded on quite a smooth day anyway. There wasn't a whole lot of turbulence. But this is now the same footage, but stabilized with gyroflow. And actually, this actually looks quite good. The footage is a little bit more stable than it was beforehand. I think the stabilization has actually worked. And you'll see this in the upcoming clips as well. I think the conclusion I kind of made was that gyroflow on this camera seems to work quite well if there's very minimal kind of like oscillation in the camera. If the camera's been bumped around just a little bit, gyroflow seems to work quite well. It's when you start getting quite extreme movements in the camera that it doesn't work so well at all. Anyway, after I did this flight, which is in 1080p at 50 frames per second, I then did another flight at 2.5K, 50 frames per second. I don't really know why anybody would ever use that resolution. It's kind of a weird kind of middle ground resolution, but I thought I'd just do a test anyway. So that's what this footage here is. And then I'll now show you the same footage but with gyroflow enabled. And again, I think you'll agree, gyroflow did do something. It did kind of work. Now after that, I then did the same kind of flight again, but this time I had the camera set to 4K 30 frames per second. So I did have the gyro data with that recording. And yeah, the footage to me, it doesn't really look any different to what you'd get with the 1080p recording. That's probably because I don't have a fancy 4K monitor here. I've just got a standard monitor. I couldn't really see the difference between using 4K and 1080. And yeah, in general, I just tend to record 1080 anyway because it's easier to edit, it's easier to upload. Most people don't have 4K monitors anyway. And yeah, if you can't really see the difference in the resolution anyway, then why waste memory on your SD card? You might as well just record in 1080. But yeah, I did that, and here's the footage, stabilized in Gyroflow. Again, it looks all right. It looks entirely okay. Now, I did also try doing a flight with the camera set to 4K at 50 frames per second. Screen for you here. Basically the same as before, but you got a slightly faster frame rate. But in this case, there's no gyro data. I don't know why it is, but you can't record gyro data when you've got the camera recording 4K at 50 frames per second. But to be honest, I don't think that matters. As I got to touch upon a couple of minutes ago, DaVinci Resolve's optical stabilization is really good. And I think most of the time it actually works better than Gyroflow. So this footage you're seeing on the screen now, this is that 4K footage at 50 frames per second, stabilized with DaVinci Resolve. And I think you'll agree, it looks just as good as if it was stabilized with Gyroflow. So yeah, I don't think you need to be put off by the fact that this camera can't record gyro data at 4K 50 frames per second. You can just use DaVinci Resolve completely for free, still get the stabilized footage that you want. There's only one other thing I want to mention regarding this flight footage, is I noticed that the footage was looking a bit oversaturated with the default settings. The image just looked a little bit too warm for my liking. It didn't look particularly natural. But I did notice in the settings there was an option to use a flat color profile. So I did enable that, and then I did this flight here with that mode enabled. And yeah, as you can see, it just makes the colors a little bit more muted. It doesn't kind of boost any of the colors or anything. It's kind of just collecting the raw data. It's presenting you with quite a bland color palette, but then it's much better for editing. So if you want to, color grade your footage, flying with the camera set to the flat color profile is much better. So that's the footage that I recorded with the camera on my aircrafts, and I was quite happy with the results that I got. I found that with those particular clips, Gyroflow seemed to work quite well. But as I said a minute ago, I suspect that's because the camera actually wasn't moving around very much. It was just minor kind of wobbles that the Gyroflow software is having to deal with, and it seemed to do a pretty good job. So yeah, moving on. So the next thing I did after the flight footage was I then did a test at home to test how good the camera is in low light. And one, that's just kind of out of my own curiosity. Two, also because I did see on Instagram Hawkeye had posted a video clip on there kind of boasting that the camera was particularly good in low light. So I did do a test of that, and just to make the test a little bit more interesting, at the same time I recorded the exact same footage with my phone, which is a Samsung Galaxy S20 FE. And I also used my DJI Osmo Action 4, which is the DJI's flagship action camera. And yeah, I'll put that footage on the screen for you now. So you're seeing the exact same scene being recorded at the exact same time with all three cameras. And actually, yeah, I think I've got to hand it to Hawkeye. I think out of these three cameras here, I think that the Thumb 2 does win. Now it is kind of obvious to see that there's a lot more noise in the footage from the Thumb 2. You can tell that they've got the ISO bumped way up to a very high level. But yeah, you can see a little bit more detail, especially in the sort of the shady area down the bottom here. You can see a little bit more of like my neighbor's garden fence in the footage from the Thumb 2 than you can from any of the other cameras. The only downside is if you look at the highlighted area and the distance there, where there's a light shining on the Thumb 2, because it's kind of boosted that ISO and it's probably changed the shutter speed a little bit. That area now looks a little bit blown out, whereas in the other two cameras, not so much. It's a little bit of a trade-off, I guess, for the Thumb 2. By being able to see the dark a little bit better, it does mean that the brighter things are blown out a little bit. But yeah, in general, I was actually reasonably impressed with the footage from the Thumb 2 in the dark. It's nothing amazing, and it's certainly not as good as anything you'd get out of the Walkstyle Alpha Pro camera, which is the one that I have as the FPV camera in my aircraft. But still, I was reasonably impressed with it. Now, one other thing that I did want to try was portrait mode on the camera. On Hawkeye's Instagram feed, I've seen multiple examples of them having the camera in a portrait kind of aspect ratio rather than a horizontal one. But I couldn't make that work because I couldn't see an option anywhere in the settings to kind of rotate the camera sideways like that. I don't know whether I'm missing something or whether this is something that's coming out in a later firmware update. I'm not really sure. But either way, I couldn't test the portrait mode, which was a little bit annoying. So now I showed you all that footage, let's now kind of do a little bit of a summary of my findings. So in general, I was quite happy with the image quality from the camera. I thought it was good. And the same thing for the wide dynamic range. I felt it worked reasonably well. Just in general, the footage just looked nice. I don't really have any complaints. The battery life on the camera, I thought that was fantastic. The fact you can get 95 minutes off of a single charge, I think that's really good, especially for a camera of this size. And another thing I was actually pleasantly surprised by was the app. I found the app just worked very well. Easy to connect to the camera. There's nothing weird happening with the app. It just worked. Didn't have any problems connecting. It's a simple app, but it has everything you need in there to be able to configure the camera. It just works. So I was very happy with the app. Now, obviously, all of those things I just mentioned there are good, but there are some downsides that I found with this camera. And I think the first one we need to talk about is gyro flow. This camera is advertised as being a gyro cam. It's one that's designed to be used with gyro flow. But in pretty much all of the use cases, all the footage I had where I tried to stabilize the footage, I found it didn't work. The only time I was able to get good footage was the flight footage that I showed you. But as I mentioned earlier in the video, that footage is recorded on days where it's very calm. The aircraft wasn't exactly getting bumped around a whole lot either. So yeah, the fact that gyro flow doesn't work particularly well with this gyro cam, that's obviously not a good thing. I don't know whether that's an issue with the camera. Maybe the gyro on the camera isn't very good. Or alternatively, I don't know if that's an issue with gyro flow. Maybe the software isn't very good. Or whether it's an issue with the settings that are on gyro flow. Or maybe it's used error on my behalf. I don't know. But either way, I didn't have a good time with gyro flow, and I can't really praise the camera for being a gyro cam when it doesn't work with gyro flow. Now, on the note of downsides, just a couple of other ones I want to mention. So the fact this camera hasn't got any kind of wind noise suppression, and the fact that the audio is a little bit muffled, a bit tinny, that's not great. But I mean, I guess it really depends what you're using the camera for. If you're just using it on drones like I am, you probably don't really care about the audio quality. If you do plan to use a camera like this as an action camera, then maybe you do. It certainly has to be acknowledged that the audio quality on the camera isn't particularly good. And the final thing that's a bit of a downside for the camera is the fact that it's not waterproof. I can't see anywhere on Hawkeye's website any mention of the camera being waterproof or dustproof or having any kind of IP rating whatsoever. Although saying that, when I was doing the test of the camera when I was out running, it was lightly raining that day and the camera was completely fine. So maybe it does have a little bit of water resistance to it, but I don't really think it's got much to it, which is a shame. The last thing I just want to mention about the camera is it gets very hot when you have Wi-Fi enabled. I mentioned earlier on I did a test where I left the camera running and it recorded for 95 minutes. That was with the Wi-Fi off and the camera was barely warm to the touch at the end of that. But if you have the Wi-Fi enabled on the camera, after 2 or 3 minutes, the camera will then get very hot. It'll get uncomfortably hot. So yeah, if you ever use the Wi-Fi on the camera, try and use it sparingly. And if you need to use it for a long time, maybe just try and be mindful about trying to keep the camera cool somehow, maybe with a fan or something. So yeah, so that's a bit of summary. So yeah, what's my overall conclusion? I like the camera, actually. I actually think it's a pretty good camera. Hawkeye, like I said, they're trying to kind of market this as being a bit of a sort of generic action camera. I think they're trying to be a bit of competition for Insta360 with their Go series of cameras. In that regard, it doesn't make sense. The camera does not work as a generic action camera. The fact that the footage you get whilst you're walking around or running or, doing any kind of excessive movement, you can't stabilize it. So it's useless in that regard. And the fact that it's not waterproof and the audio quality isn't particularly good, it just doesn't make a particularly good action camera. But as a camera to put on a drone, like on a fixed wing drone or even a multi-rotor. I actually think it's actually pretty good. One thing that's sort of annoying about fixed-wing drones is that it's very hard to put a GoPro on a lot of them. Although fixed-wing aircraft can, potentially carry a lot more weight, they're a lot more sensitive to, the aircraft being balanced, and you have to be very careful about where you can put something like a heavy camera. So in general, most of us that fly fixed-wing don't put GoPros onto our aircraft. That plus the fact that GoPros are also not particularly aerodynamic. They're quite big. And unlike multi-rotors, fixed-wing aircraft actually care about the rules of physics and about how aerodynamics work. So, yeah, it's not practical to put a GoPro on a fixed-wing aircraft, whereas putting something like this on, which is very small and is very lightweight, it actually works really, really well. And I think it's a good substitute for a GoPro. Obviously, the quality is not going to be as good as what you get from a GoPro, but I think for most of us that, are just flying for fun and maybe just want to get some nice photos to show some friends or put on YouTube, I think a camera like this actually is kind of the perfect option. Now, the other thing that I specifically love about this camera is the fact it's got that built-in battery. So in the past, when I had the Runcam Thumb 1 and 2, and also the Hawkeye Thumb 1, I found those cameras were really good to put onto your fixed-wing aircraft, but you had to kind of wire them into your aircraft, because you didn't have a built-in battery, so you had to provide a power supply. That meant it wasn't particularly easy to move the camera between multiple aircraft, and you don't want to be buying loads of these. Ideally, you want one that you can move between multiple aircraft. Because they were wired into one aircraft, you couldn't then easily put it onto another. The fact this camera has a built-in battery means I haven't got to wire it into anything. It means I can now easily change this from one aircraft to another as many times as I want without having to worry about wiring. And for me, that's the real winner for this camera. So yeah, my overall conclusion is this camera is actually, I like it. I'm pretty impressed with it. The image quality is reasonably good. The wide dynamic range is reasonably good. I don't care about the audio quality because it's going on an aircraft. The battery life, I think, is fantastic. For me, it's a winner. It's a nice camera, and I'm going to be using this on my aircraft moving forwards. So yeah, that's my conclusion. I quite like this camera. I'm going to be using it moving forwards. But yeah, it's up to you, obviously, what you think. I try to provide reviews which are just very objective. I kind of just try to give you the facts. It's up to you to decide whether or not you like this camera. And it doesn't really make any difference to me whether or not you go ahead and buy it. There's no affiliate links here or anything. This is just a generic, straightforward review, and then you can decide for yourself. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed watching this video, and I hope you found it interesting. If you have, please do give the video a like. And I basically run out of things to say now, so I'll catch you in the next video. Cheers, guys. Bye.